will now be recorded.
Actually, I think I jumped the gun a bit. Let me make sure that Julie gets the live stream going, and then I'll be happy to call the roll for this meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, and we are good. This is a meeting of the FSMB Recommendations Review Committee. I will call the roll briefly. Dr. Schottenstein.
Here.
Ms. Montgomery. Ms. Montgomery, are you, I see that she's logged on, but she may have stepped away for a moment. Dr. Rothermel.
Hold on a second. Benton, I believe we did a switch on committee members. So I think Betty is actually, we switched Betty for Dr. Feibel on the committee.
You're correct. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong list here. Dr. Rothermel.
Present.
Dr. Safran.
Present.
And Dr. Feibel.
Here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very kindly. So, we're here today with the newly constituted FSMB committee. And we may recall that the State Medical Board engaged the FSMB to audit our processes in the wake of the Strauss Working Group recommendations. Among other things, they had two particular recommendations for the board that we would like to address in this committee. The first one is the option to reconstitute the Quality Assurance Committee to audit our closed cases. The second particular recommendation is to involve a public member in the assessment of our complaints, essentially to team up with the secretary and the supervising member as a third voice in that process. And so we have several options going forward with regard to the possible levels of involvement of public members. We certainly have the option of fully implementing a public member into the process, and essentially, that person would act as a third party along with the secretary and supervising member to assess all complaints. Second option is to contemplate adding a public member when it comes just to the sexual misconduct complaints. The third option is really not to make a change. And so I had this thought that, and I don't want to be insensitive to it, the secretary and supervising member do a lot of work, of course. It's a lot of manpower, a lot of hours, and it would be in that regard asking a lot of a public member as well to sort of step up in that way. So I certainly want to be cognizant of that as we're contemplating this and not unmindful of it. And in that respect, I also had this thought, which is, we have 3 public members. And so if we were to either fully implement a public member into the process or just with regard to sexual misconduct complaints, the other option we have is to rotate through our 3 members, essentially like, every third complaint would go to a public member, and that would, keep that workload down for those individual public members. So that's sort of a brief summary of, our meeting today. Ms. Montgomery.
I think Bob, Jackalone, and I, Michael isn't on, but 2 of your public board members are on, and it seems to me that, Mr. Jackalone and I have talked about the fact that we could rotate in, but I don't think you could do the one every, maybe I misunderstand the rounds process, but I think you could probably assign us maybe for, 3 months or 2 months or whatever the committee says, and that we're there if it's at rounds, and in some way work us instead of having the FSMB report suggested an investigations committee and another couple of committees, and instead let us be part of a process in the rounds. And I don't think you'd limit it to, if you want to, at the biggest, you don't want to limit it to just sexual stuff. It's, I don't think. I think there are other things that are just as equally as important, although not as obviously as important. So I think you could do I think you should fold us in. I think it doesn't have to be quite as complex as FSMB, and because we still want to be active members of the board. It defeats our purpose if we're not active members of the board.
So I'd actually be glad, Dr. Rothermel, to get your thoughts on the matter, because of course you're part of that Secretary Supervising Member team, and Dr. Safran, of course, both of you, because, on some level we have a process that's working well, and it's been working well for us. So, there is that bigger picture, right, which is, why are we contemplating making a change when we have a process that has served us well over time? And I guess just sort of my own thought is that, having heard what the FSMB representatives had to say, it sort of rang true to me that it makes sense, certainly optically, to have public member involvement. I think that it is a demonstration, essentially, that we are being as open-minded as we can, about these complaints that come in, and avoiding the reflex to circle the wagons. I think that having a public member involved shows that we are not, in a reflexive way, in some way trying to protect our own, but rather trying to apply justice in the most transparent way that we can.
Well, it's a big question. I'm certainly willing to go either way with this. I don't know that the system's broken the way we're doing it now, but I do think that there's some considerations that include the time that's involved. For example, I will just tell you, last week alone, we had 90 complaints put into our boxes to review. It takes quite a lot of time to do that. That was almost a full-time week. And we have a good process as it stands now in reviewing these complaints individually, each of us on our own, and finding that if we disagree, then have a discussion when we do meet for rounds. And I assume that discussion could continue if there were 3 people and it was 2 and 1, but theoretically, if it's 2 and 1, you're going to go with 2. You're not going to have much discussion. So that's another thing to consider. I think very importantly, this person would not be able to vote. And because of the number of complaints that we do review, and many of which do get closed, but any touch on any of these complaints, if a further complaint comes in, and for example, that public member was not on the review committee at that point in time, they would not be able to vote on that. So we're taking yet one more person out of the discussion at the board meeting. And I have concern if we're rotating, we may be taking there. It seems to me this could be a bit of a nightmare in figuring out who can vote on which ones also at the board meeting. I think that the concern, I appreciate that people saying that they'd like all the cases looked at, and that's fine. I think the biggest concern, obviously we had this review done mainly because of the Strauss situation and the sexual situations. And we have the protocol now for that, so that we see that these cases go through a huge amount of look at through our staff at the board before they even get to the secretary and supervising member. So they're looked at by these people, interestingly enough, all who are consumers they're not consumer members of the board, but they are consumers. And these are, many are attorneys, they're investigators, you know, the deputy director, and then before it comes to us. So, you know, there are a lot of things to consider. We have to, it's a process that we have to keep moving. You know, you can't wait long with things when you have your sales force full of cases. You know, you can't put it off too long. So it's an everyday job, basically.
Thank you so much. Dr. Safran, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes. Well, first of all, the supervising member could be a consumer member. The secretary can't, but the supervising member can and has been in the past. So that still puts a consumer member into that spot, should it come out that way. Number two is what we close goes through a lot of hands before we close it. And to have a third person reviewing 90 complaints every week, it seems to be the wrong way to me. The system isn't broken. The system really doesn't have any issues. The complaints come in, they're triaged, they go through the process, and they're either closed or they go on to more investigation or enforcement. So the system really isn't broken. I think the hot button really is the sexual misconduct. And I think that's where we can incorporate what the FSMB suggested. Maybe you have a consumer person review all the sexual misconduct claims and or whatever you want to call them, complaints, and that kind of solves the problem. But when I started doing this 7 years ago, we were in the thousands of complaints that were backlogged, thousands. And Dr. Bechtel is shaking his head because he knows that that's, you know, and we have a system now that works very, very well, and our queues are almost empty every week. So I just don't think that we need to revamp everything. And I think the middle road here may be just the sexual misconduct.
Thank you so much. And to your point,
I'm sorry, Dr. Schottenstein. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're having a problem with one of our streaming computers, and it's going to shut down against our will in about 4 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt the meeting because our live stream is going to go down briefly. What I have done is set up a part 2 of this committee meeting. I'm going to send a link to that to everyone, and I'm afraid we're going to have to log off and log back into the new meeting and then wait until we can live stream again, which should just be a few minutes is what it appears to be. So I apologize for the technical issues. So right now, actually, what we need to do is recess the committee meeting so that we can resume in a few minutes.
Okay.
And Dr. Bechtel make his point.
Do they have a link in the email that they can log back into? This part 2?
No, the part, I'll need to send that in just a minute. I had to set up an entirely new meeting just a minute ago, so we don't have the link to the part 2 of the committee meeting. I'll have to send that to you on ASAP. Beg pardon?
They'll check their email for that part 2 link.
Yes, and I'll send that around to staff as well.
Okay, so Benton,
Yes, I believe that Julie will be able to take care of that. I'll make sure that everything's good on that end so that we can resume the meeting in a public fashion.
Yeah.
Okay, so Benton, are we logging off now then? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. All right, well then I'll see everybody on the other side.
This conference is no longer being recorded.